All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're diving deep into something I think a lot of us can relate to, making those long-haul economy flights a little less, well, brutal. And the best part, we're using your research, the stuff you sent in, to make this as relevant as possible to you.
I've got to say, the podcast you found is gold. The author doesn't just skim the surface. They've clearly spent some serious time in those economy seats, and they've come up with some pretty insightful strategies.
Exactly. So our mission today is to sift through all those tips and tricks and pull out the real gems, the stuff that can actually transform your next long haul from dreading it to, okay, this might not be so bad.
And I think the key to that transformation starts way before you even get to the airport. The pre-flight prep, that's where the magic happens.
All right, so pre-flight prep, what's step one?
Step one is being smart about your ticket. I know we all love a bargain, but those basic economy fares, sometimes they're not worth the savings, especially on a long flight.
Yeah, I've been tempted by those fares before, but then I start thinking about the restrictions, like getting stuck with a middle seat or paying a fortune to check a bag.
Exactly. The podcast uses United Basic Economy as an example, where you're basically limited to a personal item, you don't get to choose your seat until check-in, and checked bags come with some hefty fees.
Okay, so if you're someone who likes to be prepared and have options, maybe basic economy isn't the way to go. And while we're on the topic of airlines, have you noticed how they're not all created equal, especially when it comes to those long hauls?
Oh, absolutely. The podcast actually calls out Singapore Airlines and Air New Zealand for their amazing service and entertainment. So if those airlines fly your route, definitely worth considering.
Noted. And while we're thinking about routes, let's not forget about layovers. I used to hate them, but now I kind of see them as an opportunity.
Right. Some airports are basically destinations in themselves. The podcast mentions airports with movie theaters, swimming pools, even in-transit hotels where you can catch a few zizzes or grab a shower.
Okay, that's a game changer. I'm definitely factoring layover amenities into my flight search from now on.
It can make a huge difference in your overall journey. Now, let's talk seat strategy. Most people aim for the window or aisle, but the podcast suggests something a little different. Consider the back of the plane.
Really? The back? Why?
Well, you have a better chance of scoring an empty row, or at least an empty seat next to you, especially if the flight isn't full. And even if you don't get lucky at booking, you can scope things out once everyone's boarded and maybe make a move.
I like that. It adds a little bit of strategy to the whole boarding process. And speaking of strategy, let's talk upgrades. I have to admit, I do fantasize about those first-class seats, but realistically, that's not always possible.
We all have those first-class dreams, right? But using your air miles strategically, even for premium economy, can be a good investment. Even a little extra legroom can make a huge difference.
True. It's all about prioritizing where you're willing to splurge. Now, something I always struggle with is that time zone shift. How do you prep for that?
Jet lag is brutal. The podcast emphasizes two things: adjusting your sleep schedule before the flight and changing your watch to the destination time zone as soon as you board.
But those are good practical tips. And speaking of practical, the podcast mentions something I've never actually tried, but it sounds game-changing, especially for international travel.
You're talking about eSIM cards, right?
Yes, I've always just stuck with my regular SIM card and dealt with the roaming charges.
I know, those charges can be a pain. But with an eSIM, you can basically download a digital SIM card to your phone and switch between carriers and data plans super easily, especially abroad.
So convenient. Do you have any eSIM providers you recommend?
The podcast actually suggests Holofly, and they have a link in the description with a discount for our listeners.
Awesome. Okay, so we've talked tickets, airlines, layovers, even eSIM cards. What else should we be thinking about before we even leave the house?
Well, the podcast also talks about the importance of de-stressing before you even get to the airport. You don't want to start your journey already frazzled.
I've totally been there. Rushing to the airport at the last minute, stressed and exhausted. Now I try to have a relaxing morning routine before I travel. Whether it's a good breakfast or just some quiet time with a book, it makes a difference.
I love that. Setting the tone for a smooth journey. And speaking of setting the tone, the podcast brings up a topic a lot of people might not think about, but it's actually key for in-flight comfort.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's digestion. Long flights, cramped spaces, unfamiliar foods, it can all wreak havoc on your system.
Oh, yeah. Nothing worse than feeling bloated and uncomfortable on a long flight.
Right. So the podcast suggests something a little unconventional, but surprisingly effective.
All right, lay it on me.
They recommend avoiding solid food for at least 12 hours before your flight.
Whoa, That's intense. Not sure I could go that long without eating.
I know, it sounds extreme, but think about it. By sticking to liquids and easily digestible foods in the hours before your flight, you can minimize the chances of bloating, gas, all those discomforts that can make a long flight even worse.
Okay, I see the logic there. It's all about prioritizing comfort. And speaking of comfort, let's move on to a topic that can either be a source of stress or a source of satisfaction.
Packing.
Packing, the art of fitting your entire life into a single suitcase.
Right. I used to be the queen of overpacking, but I've learned that less is definitely more when it comes to air travel.
Absolutely. The podcast really emphasizes well-organized luggage, where everything has its place. Packing cubes are a lifesaver for this. They're like little drawers for your suitcase, keeping everything separated and easy to find.
Oh yeah, I've seen those all over social media. Are they really worth the hype?
Totally worth it. And the podcast also recommends this rolling collapsible luggage, perfect for maximizing space, especially if you have limited storage at your destination.
Collapsible luggage. That sounds amazing. I'm always struggling to fit my suitcase into those tiny hotel rooms.
Right. And we'll have a link in the description where you can check out the rolling luggage and those packing cubes.
Perfect. I'll be clicking on that later. While we're talking luggage, the podcast also mentions some other cool options, like backpacks that fit over suitcase handles for easy maneuvering, and totes with built-in wireless chargers so you can stay powered up on the go.
Okay, these are all great ideas. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Carry-on packing mastery. A well-packed carry-on can make or break your in-flight experience.
For sure. The podcast has some great tips for this. They recommend wearing your bulkier items on the plane, like jackets and boots, to save space in your luggage.
Classic trick. I always wear my heaviest shoes and layer up on the plane.
Smart. And they also swear by the rolling technique for clothes. Prevents wrinkles and saves more space than folding.
I've tried rolling before, but I always feel like my clothes end up more wrinkled.
The key is to roll them tightly and smoothly. And if you're really worried about wrinkles, you can use packing folders, which are like garment bags designed for packing cubes.
Packing folders. Interesting. I'll have to look into those.
We'll link to those as well. Don't forget those little extras that can make a big difference in comfort, like an eye mask, earplugs, and a travel pillow.
Absolutely. Those are essential. The podcast specifically recommends the Mantis sleep mask for blocking out light and the TRTL pillow for neck support.
I've heard great things about both of those. Speaking of which, do you have a favorite pair of noise-canceling headphones?
You know, I've been thinking about investing in a good pair. Any recommendations?
The podcast actually raves about the Apple AirPods Max. They're a bit pricier, but the noise cancellation is amazing, and they're super comfy for long periods.
Okay, sold. I'm adding those to my wish list.
Excellent choice. And don't worry, we'll include a link in the description. Now let's talk about packing that carry-on strategically. It's just as important as packing your checked bag.
Right. I've definitely made the mistake of overpacking my personal item before and ended up lugging this heavy bag around the airport.
I feel you. The key is to be ruthless and only pack what you absolutely need during the flight. Phone, wallet, passport, maybe a book, snacks, medications, anything you'll need to access easily.
So it's all about prioritizing those in-flight essentials. What are some of your must-haves for the flight itself?
Noise-canceling headphones, definitely. And I always bring a cozy scarf or wrap, even if I'm going somewhere warm, because those planes can get chilly.
Oh yeah, a travel blanket is a must for me. The podcast actually suggests buckling your seatbelt over your blanket so you don't get woken up by the flight attendants if the seatbelt sign comes on.
That's a great hack. I'm stealing that one. Speaking of comfort, what are your go-to outfits for long flights?
Comfort is key for me. Usually, loose-fitting, breathable clothes that won't wrinkle easily. The podcast actually recommends a brand called Seen in Linko that specializes in travel-friendly clothes that are also stylish.
Ooh, I'll have to check them out. And for a touch of luxury, the podcast suggests Quinn's cashmere wraps. Super soft, warm, and they pack down small.
Cashmere on a plane. Yes, please. We'll include links to both brands in the description.
Perfect. Now let's talk about another crucial aspect of in-flight comfort: staying active.
Right. I've heard it's really important to get up and move around on long flights to prevent blood clots and keep your circulation going.
Exactly. The podcast has some good tips for this, like doing simple stretches in your seat and getting up to walk around the cabin whenever possible.
I try to get up and stretch at least once an hour. Having an aisle seat definitely helps with that.
For sure. And while we're on the topic of staying healthy, remember that refillable water bottle. The podcast even recommends a collapsible option that can be easily tucked away.
Ooh, a collapsible water bottle. That's brilliant. I'm always struggling to fit a regular water bottle in my carry-on.
Right. Staying hydrated is so important, especially on those long flights. But speaking of drinks, the podcast cautions against overdoing the alcohol, soda, and
Oh
caffeine.
yeah, those tiny airplane bathrooms are not forgiving after too much soda.
Exactly. It's tempting to indulge in those free drinks, but moderation is key for a comfortable flight. So, we've talked about staying active and hydrated. What else should we be thinking about for our in-flight checklist?
Well, we've got to stay entertained on those long flights, otherwise it's just hours of staring at the ceiling.
Right. That's why the podcast really stresses bringing your own entertainment.
So downloaded movies, podcasts, maybe a good old-fashioned book.
Exactly. They make a great point about podcasts. They use less battery than movies and can be super engaging.
I am a huge podcast fan, so that's definitely my go-to for in-flight entertainment. And if you're worried about dropping an earbud, especially when you're dozing off, those Apple AirPods Max we mentioned earlier are a good option. They're a bit more substantial and less likely to go flying. Plus, the noise canceling is top-notch, which is essential for blocking out all that airplane ambiance.
Oh, for sure. Those are game changers. Speaking of game changers, the podcast has some seriously clever hacks for actually getting some sleep in economy. Because, let's be honest, those seats were not designed for a good night's rest.
Okay, I'm ready for those sleep strategies. I'm all about maximizing comfort, even in those less than ideal conditions. What are their top tips?
They recommend a few key items to transform that economy seat into a cozy haven. First up, cozy socks. Slipping out of your shoes and into some soft socks can make a world of difference.
Yes, it's all about those little comforts, and a good eye mask is essential for blocking out the light. The podcast specifically recommends the Manta Sleep Mask, known for its light-blocking capabilities and comfortable design.
I've heard great things about that one. And of course, we can't forget the travel pillow. The podcast loves the TRTL pillow for its neck support. But they also have this pro tip that I absolutely love.
Okay, I'm all ears for a pro tip. What is it?
Bring your own pillow from home. I know, it sounds extra, but think about it. It's familiar, it's comfy, and it might just trick your mind into thinking you're in your own bed.
That's genius. Why haven't I thought of that before? I'm totally trying that on my next long haul. And for those who need a little extra help falling asleep, the podcast mentions magnesium tablets or melatonin. But as always, check with your doctor before trying any new supplements.
Absolutely. The podcast also talks about creating a bedtime routine, even on the plane.
That's interesting. What does that look like in the air?
It's about mimicking those calming rituals you do at home. Washing your face, brushing your teeth, maybe listening to some soothing music. It's about signaling to your body that it's time to wind down.
And for those who like aromatherapy, the podcast mentions lavender oil for relaxation. Always a good idea to be mindful of your seatmates, though.
Of course, you don't want to overwhelm anyone with scents. Now, let's fast forward to landing. The goal is to arrive feeling somewhat human, and the podcast has some good advice for post-flight recovery.
Okay, tell me everything. I want to hit the ground running, not stumbling around like a zombie.
First tip, freshen up as soon as possible. Pack those toiletries, and Travel-Sized Cosmetics Biossance gets a shout out for their travel-friendly products so you can revitalize in that first restroom. Imagine stepping off that plane feeling clean and refreshed.
That's the dream. I'll definitely be packing my Biossance travel essentials. Speaking of revitalization, the podcast highlights the importance of getting daylight and moving around once you arrive.
It's a powerful way to reset your body clock, even if it feels counterintuitive when you're exhausted. The podcast even tells a story about someone who took a 24-hour flight and then went for a 12-hour walk. Talk about dedication.
Wow, that's intense. I'm not sure I can handle a 12-hour walk after a flight like that, but I'm definitely on board with getting some fresh air and movement. And for those of us who rely on that morning coffee, the podcast recommends resuming your normal caffeine routine upon waking up.
It's all about getting back into your regular rhythm as quickly as possible.
This has been such a jam-packed deep dive, from pre-flight prep to post-flight recovery.
I know. It's amazing how much valuable information is packed into this podcast.
And don't worry, we've got you covered. We'll include links to all the recommended products, resources, and that Holofly eSIM discount in the description below. Be sure to check them out and start planning your next long-haul adventure.
And if you want even more travel tips, tricks, and hacks, make sure to stick around for part 2 of this deep dive. We've got even more insightful strategies and personal anecdotes from the podcast that you won't want to miss. We'll come back to our deep dive into making those long-haul economy flights a little more bearable.
We're picking up right where we left off, unearthing those hidden gems from that podcast you shared.
And I think this next section is going to be right up your alley.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
It's all about creating a sleep sanctuary, even in those cramped economy seats.
Oh, I am so here for this. Sleep is my nemesis on long flights. I'm always so jealous of those people who can just conk out effortlessly.
Right, like they have some secret formula.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the podcast actually reveals some pretty clever tricks for maximizing sleep, even in economy. And it all starts with the right gear.
Okay, so let's talk about those sleep essentials. What does the podcast recommend?
Well, first and foremost, a good eye mask is crucial. You've got to block out all that light, whether it's from the overhead reading lamps, people's glowing screens, or even just the sunrise.
Makes sense. I've tried those flimsy airline eye masks, but they never really do the trick.
Right, you need something that's both comfortable and effective. That's where the Manta Sleep Mask comes in. The podcast raves about it, and honestly, I'm a huge fan too. It's made of this super soft, breathable material, and it has these adjustable cups that mold to your face, so it blocks out all the light without putting any pressure on your eyelids.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm adding that to my wish list right now.
Yeah.
We'll make sure to include a link in the description for everyone.
Perfect. Now, while we're on the topic of comfort, let's talk neck support. Those airplane headrests, they're notoriously bad, which makes it nearly impossible to get comfy enough to sleep.
Ugh, tell me about it. My neck is always stiff and sore after a long flight.
The podcast actually suggests two approaches here. The first is the TRTL pillow, which has this unique wraparound design that gives you great support for your head and neck. It's a bit bulkier than some travel pillows, but it's so worth it for the comfort. And the second approach is surprisingly simple, but effective.
Okay, lay it on me. What is it?
Bring your own pillow from home.
Really?
I know it sounds a little extra, but think about it. It's your pillow, it's familiar, it's comfy, and it just might be the ticket to actually sleeping on that flight.
That is brilliant. Why have I never thought of that before?
Right. It's one of those things that seems so obvious in hindsight, but it really speaks to the podcast's emphasis on creating a personalized sleep haven, even in economy. It's about bringing those little comforts from home to make the journey feel more familiar and relaxing.
I love that. It's like building your own little nest in the sky. Speaking of creating a relaxing atmosphere, the podcast mentions some other strategies for winding down and drifting off.
Yeah, they talk about the importance of having a bedtime routine, even on a plane.
That's interesting. What does a bedtime routine even look like in the air?
Well, it's about replicating those calming things you do at home. So washing your face, brushing your teeth, maybe even changing into some comfy clothes like those cozy socks we talked about earlier.
Right, those cozy socks. And for the aromatherapy fans, the podcast mentions using lavender oil for relaxation. Just maybe check with your seatmates first, right?
Oh, definitely. Don't want to be that person. But if aromatherapy helps you relax, a little bit of lavender oil on a tissue or a travel diffuser can be amazing.
And they also talk about those natural sleep aids like magnesium tablets and melatonin.
Yes, but as always, talk to your doctor before trying any new supplements, especially if you have any health conditions or taking other medications.
Okay, so we've got the eye mask, the neck support, comfy clothes, maybe some lavender oil. What else can we do to create that sleep-conducive environment?
Well, the podcast talks about minimizing distractions and creating a sense of separation from all the hustle and bustle of the cabin.
Yeah, it's hard to relax when you're surrounded by noise and movement.
Exactly. That's where noise-canceling headphones come in. We talked about the Apple AirPods Max earlier, but there are tons of other great options out there.
Oh yeah, and the price range for those is pretty wide, so you can definitely find something that fits your budget.
For sure. And even if you don't want to go the noise-canceling route, a good pair of earplugs can make a huge difference.
Totally agree. I always have earplugs in my carry-on, just in case.
It's always good to be prepared. Now, beyond noise, the podcast also mentions minimizing visual distractions.
It's like those glowing screens from phones and laptops.
Exactly. And those overhead reading lights. If you're trying to sleep, it's best to dim those as much as possible. And if you're really sensitive to light, you can even use a dark scarf or a travel blanket to create a little cocoon around your head and block out any stray light.
Ooh, that's clever. I'm going to try that. I'm always struggling to block out light, even with an eye mask.
It's all about finding those little tricks that work for you. And the podcast does a great job of offering different options so you can experiment and see what helps you create that perfect sleep environment.
I love that. It's like a choose-your-own-adventure for sleep comfort. Speaking of comfort, let's talk about something that can really make or break your sleep experience.
Temperature. Oh, temperature is so crucial. I'm always freezing on planes, even when everyone else seems perfectly comfortable.
I know, it's like they blast the AC, and those airplane blankets are usually so thin and scratchy.
Right. That's why the podcast recommends layering up and bringing your own cozy blanket or wrap. We talked about the Quinn's cashmere wraps earlier, but a lightweight fleece blanket or even just a cozy scarf can work too. It's about creating those layers of warmth.
And the podcast also mentions that trick with the air vent.
Oh, yes. They say to adjust the air vent so it's pointing right at you, creating a little pocket of warm air.
That's a good one. I'm always messing with those air vents, trying to find that sweet spot of temperature.
It's all about taking control of your little space, even in those cramped seats. And speaking of taking control, the podcast has some really good advice for dealing with jet lag, which can be one of the toughest parts of long-haul travel.
Ugh. Jet lag is the worst. It can take days to adjust, and it can really mess with your whole trip.
I know exactly what you mean. But the podcast emphasizes that we're not totally helpless against jet lag. There are things we can do to minimize the effects and adjust faster.
Okay, I'm ready for those jet lag busting tips. What does the podcast suggest?
Well, the first tip is to start adjusting your sleep schedule a few days before your flight. If you're traveling east, try going to bed and waking up an hour earlier each day. And if you're traveling west, do the opposite. Go to bed and wake up an hour later each day.
So it's like easing your body into the new time zone gradually.
Exactly. And once you're on the plane, the podcast recommends changing your watch to the destination time zone and trying to eat and sleep according to that schedule.
Oh, good reminder. I always forget to change my watch, and then I'm just totally confused about what time it is.
I've been there, but it's such a simple thing that can really help.
And they also talk about hydration, both during the flight and after you arrive.
So important. Dehydration can make jet lag so much worse, so drink plenty of water throughout your journey. And try to avoid alcohol and caffeine, which can dehydrate you and mess with your sleep.
Okay, lots of water, no booze or coffee. Got it. What about food? Any recommendations there?
They suggest eating light, healthy meals and snacks that are high in protein and complex carbs. And try to avoid sugary and processed foods, which can spike your blood sugar and make you feel even more sluggish.
So basically, the same healthy eating habits we should be following all the time.
Exactly. But it's especially important when you're traveling and your body is already under stress.
That makes sense. Now, what about after you land? Any strategies for beating jet lag once you're at your destination?
Absolutely. The podcast stresses the importance of getting daylight as soon as possible. Sunlight helps regulate your circadian rhythm, which is your body's natural sleep-wake cycle. So even if you're exhausted, try to get outside and soak up some sun. Even a short walk around the block can help.
Okay, sunlight is key. Anything else?
They say to resist the urge to nap, even if you're tired. Try to stay awake until your normal bedtime in the new time zone. This will help your body adjust more quickly.
I know that's easier said than done, but I'll try my best. And if all else fails, they mention that more extreme but surprisingly effective strategy.
You're talking about the 12-hour walk, right?
Yes. The author shared a story about landing in Berlin after a 24-hour flight and then going for a 12-hour walk.
Crazy, right. But apparently, it worked wonders. They slept great that night and woke up feeling refreshed and jet lag free.
Wow, that's dedication. I don't know if I could handle a 12-hour walk after a flight like that, but it just goes to show that sometimes the simplest things are the best. Fresh air, movement, and daylight.
Totally. And it really reinforces the whole message of the podcast. We have more control over our long-haul economy flight experience than we think.
I love that. It's empowering to know that we can take steps to make those long journeys more comfortable and enjoyable, even in economy. But wait, there's more.
That's right. We have even more insights and tips to share. Stay tuned for part 3 of this deep dive, where we'll explore some more unexpected strategies and personal anecdotes from the podcast. You don't want to miss it.
And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive into making those long-haul economy flights a little less.
Yeah. I gotta say, this podcast has been full of surprises. They go beyond the usual advice and really get into the nitty-gritty.
Totally. Like those little things you might not even think about. For example, they recommend actually, being nice to the crew, befriending them almost.
Not in a weird way, of course, just being genuinely kind and respectful.
Exactly. It's amazing how far a little kindness can go. You never know. You might get some extra attention, or at the very least, a more pleasant interaction.
Plus, let's be real, those flight attendants work so hard. They deserve all the appreciation we can give them. Speaking of unexpected tips, there's this one for dealing with dry sinuses during the flight.
Oh, tell me about it. My sinuses always feel so dry and stuffy after a long flight.
All right. Well, the podcast recommends using a decongestant nasal spray before takeoff and descent. Apparently, those shifts in air pressure and the low humidity can really mess with our sinuses.
That's interesting. I'll have to try that. I always pack those saline nasal sprays, but maybe a decongestant would be more effective.
Yeah, worth a shot. Now, let's talk about something I think we can all relate to. Swollen feet and ankles after a long flight. Not exactly the most glamorous part of traveling.
Ugh, yeah, my feet and ankles always balloon up after a long flight. It's not pretty.
The podcast has a simple but effective solution. Elevate your feet. They suggest using a portable footrest or even your carry-on bag if it's sturdy enough. And if you want to get fancy, they mention those foot hammocks you can attach to the tray table.
A foot hammock. Now that's what I call traveling in style, even in an economy.
Right. And speaking of style, the podcast has some great recommendations for clothes that are comfy and chic.
Okay, I'm listening.
They specifically mention this brand, Yes No. They make these graphic printed sweaters and sweater dresses that are apparently perfect for layering and can even be folded into a cushion for extra back support.
Ooh, that's clever. I'm all about multifunctional clothes.
Right. Comfort and style, we can have both. And for those who need to look professional even after a long flight, they suggest packing a few key items for a quick refresh in the restroom upon arrival.
Okay, so like a little mini spa kit. What do they recommend?
Fresh socks, underwear, wet wipes, a brush, dental care items, and travel-size creams and cosmetics. Biossance gets another shout-out for their travel-friendly skincare products.
Love Biossance. Their squalane plus vitamin C rose oil is amazing for hydrating and brightening my skin after a flight. Okay, now I want to hear about those personal anecdotes the podcast mentioned.
Oh, yeah. There's a great story about a seasoned traveler who introduced the podcast author to the wonders of compression socks.
Compression socks. Interesting. I've heard mixed reviews about those.
Yeah, but this seasoned traveler swore by them for preventing leg swelling and fatigue during long flights. And it just highlights how valuable it can be to strike up a conversation with your fellow passengers. You never know what tips you might pick up.
Absolutely. It's all about embracing those unexpected connections and sharing travel wisdom. Oh, and there's that other anecdote about the jet lag remedy after a 24-hour flight.
The 12-hour walk, right?
Yes. They landed in Berlin at 9 a.m. and then just walked for 12 hours straight.
Sounds crazy, but apparently it totally worked. They slept like a baby that night and woke up feeling refreshed and jet lag free.
Amazing. I don't know if I could handle a 12-hour walk after a flight like that, but it just goes to show that sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones. Fresh air, movement, and daylight.
Couldn't agree more. And it really drives home the message of this whole podcast. We have more control over our long-haul economy experiences than we think. With a little planning, the right mindset, and a willingness to embrace those small comforts, even the most daunting flight can be surprisingly pleasant.
I love that. It's so empowering to know we don't have to just suffer through those long flights. We can actually enjoy them, or at least make them more bearable. And remember, we've got links to all those awesome products and resources in the description, from those comfy travel pillows and eye masks to collapsible luggage and noise-canceling headphones.
Don't forget to check them out. And if you want even more travel tips, tricks, and inspiration, the podcast author is actually working on something really exciting.
Oh, yeah. Tell everyone about that.
They're developing an online course all about mastering travel planning on a budget. It's going to be jam-packed with information, tips, quizzes, and even downloadable resources to help you plan those dream trips without breaking the bank.
That sounds amazing. I'm always looking for ways to travel smarter and more affordably.
Me too. And the best part, the author is offering a special discount to our listeners, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the announcement.
Such a great reminder that we can explore the world without spending a fortune. It's all about being resourceful and planning ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into long-haul economy flight comfort. We hope you found some helpful tips and are feeling inspired to take control of your next long journey. Safe travels, everyone. And remember, even in economy, a little planning and the right mindset can make all the difference.
So true. And don't forget to check out those links in the description and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that amazing online course. Happy travels.